Here's a rundown of the key points from Quiz 7. So, did Sparta win the war or did Athens lose it? Now, obviously, we know that Sparta was the victor in this war. So, what this is asking is, did the war end the way that it did because of the actions of Athens or because of the actions of Sparta? So, I'm looking for a subjective argument here about why the war ended the way it did, based on whether Athens had an advantage that they failed to make use of or made catastrophic mistakes that led to their defeat, or whether you think the victory was the result of Sparta's actions, their ability to seize the advantage and to conquer Athens. Obviously, both are true to a certain extent, so I'm asking you to argue a particular position that feels the best to you. The Athenian perspective would be taking the point of view that Athens brought about their own defeat through their own actions. The main points here would be their mistreatment of their allies, which brings about defection, especially once Sparta actively is trying to bring this about into Brasidas. The treatment of Melos is an obvious example here, but this is characteristic of a broader policy on the part of Athens. The other category here is the Sicilian expedition. The Sicilian expedition is absolutely critical in talking about Athens bringing about its own defeat, because they are deliberately overextending themselves by creating a second front that they are not prepared to take, that they misjudge from start to finish, and that brings about utter calamity in the destruction of the Athenian navy and the loss of thousands and thousands of lives. It's characteristic of what's happening within Athens as Athens becomes more polarized, becomes fixated on the means towards victory, how the hawks, if you will, within the Athenian leadership trounce those who are seeking a negotiated solution. You know, this is Alkibiades, the hawk, and Nicias, the dove, if you will, representative of a schism within Athenian leadership. This is also characteristic of Athens not learning from its own mistakes, not seeing its own hubris, because Athens did exactly the same thing in the undeclared war, expanding the war by attacking on a new front that leads to disaster. So both the mistreatment of the allies and the Sicilian expedition during the Peloponnesian War come down to the argument that Thukydides makes, that Athens is the victim of its own hubris. So, you know, this is a very characteristic Greek tragedy in a way. The Spartan point of view is that, Sparta wins this war by holding out and by escalating its ability to fight Athens. It creates a capability that it did not previously have. And so it does this in two ways. At the beginning of the war, Sparta is simply marching into Attica and besieging Athens, and this accomplishes very little. The Spartans are able to lay waste to a few farmlands, but the siege of Athens is completely ineffective because of the long walls, which allows Athens access to its port, Patadia, and therefore, the purpose of siege, which is to starve out a city, cannot be accomplished. And so the Spartans, every year at the beginning of the war, the Alkibiades War, the Spartans are marching into Attica, burning a few fields, ringing themselves around Athens as well as they can, and the Athenians do not come out and engage. There's no way for Sparta to leverage its superior ability in straight-on hoplite warfare, and so the Spartans simply have to go home. The escalation, the advancement, is creating a permanent base in Attica at Decelea. which allows the Spartans to be permanently attacking the Athenians, permanently preventing the Athenians who live in the Attica countryside from returning to their homes and bringing about the stabilization of the agricultural economy. The other thing that the Spartans do to escalate their position is to acquire a navy. The only way to defeat Athens, obvious from the beginning, is to have a navy. Well, why don't the Spartans just create a navy? To have a navy, you first need to know about ships. A nation that is able to create a navy is a nation that is already powerful at sea through maritime commerce. And so this is the position Athens is during the Persian Wars. Athens is already a very powerful economic sea power, and they are able to leverage that experience in shipbuilding and ship wielding into military naval capacity. Sparta is well inland. It doesn't have a port. It doesn't have any sea trade. It doesn't have any communion with ships at all. It doesn't like the sea. Sparta is not in a position to have seagoing commerce, much less a navy. And because their ideal is the hoplite warrior, and they eschew all other forms of vocation or avocation, they wouldn't pursue it anyway. The Spartans acquire a navy by making a deal with Persia, which causes the Anatolian Greeks, the Ionians and the Carians, to be betrayed, returned to Persian dominion in exchange for help by Persia in fighting the Athenians at sea. This brings about victory by the Spartans, but also contempt by all Greeks for Sparta, for their betrayal of their fellow Greeks. And this is demonstrative of the Spartan attitude. Just as the Athenian failure is demonstrative of their hubris, this is demonstrative of the Spartan attitude that all of the other Greeks are lesser, that the Spartans consider themselves to be, in a way, because they have achieved their ideal, the only true Greeks. How did the plague affect Athens? So sometimes people mention the plague in the first answer. The plague isn't something that the Athenians do wrong necessarily. Bringing everybody into the walls is an effective military strategy, at least at the beginning of the war, when the Spartans have to go home at the end of the campaign season. Because in the ancient world they don't know about germ theory. And so they don't know that bringing all these people within the walls is guaranteed to bring about an epidemic. That said, the cities in the ancient world are not meant for large numbers of people. They're meant to be the habitation for the skilled urban population, which is relatively small, and, for various government activities, marketplace, and so forth. People actually living there, relatively few. Most people, the vast majority of people, live out in the countryside. And so cities in the ancient world are not meant to be heavily populated. Cramming the entire population of a polis within the urban walls is going to be a recipe for overextension. And when you consider that the polis of Athens is the entire peninsula of Attica, much, much larger than any other polis. This is a vast number of people crammed into a very small place with their animals, and with no means of taking care of waste from the animals or the people. Athens does not have a river that flows through it. It has a dinky little river that flows outside the walls. But, this is, unlike Rome, which has the Tiber flowing through it or something like that, Athens, has no obvious place to dispense with human and animal waste, and no massive source of fresh water. So the ancients don't know about germs, but they do know about shit, that it is not clean, and the actual medical effects of that piling up are knowledge that comes later. But there is an extent to which the consequences of bringing everybody into Athens could potentially have been foreseen. Pericles would have weighed that against the military benefits, and the military benefits are absolutely cut and dried and demonstrated during the first phase of the war. The result of the plague of Athens is widespread death of a very large proportion of Athens. Estimates vary, a quarter, a third. A large component of the population dies. This is going to include a considerable portion of the people that would be soldiers fighting for Athens, and so Athens' military capability is reduced. But also their workers, skilled labor, farmers, are also laid waste, if you'll pardon the expression. And as a result, Sparta's economic capacity is considerably damaged for the long term. On top of this, we have the psychological effects, which are considerable. Thucydides talks about this in some detail, about how the result of the plague brings about moral corrosion, division within the populace, and disillusionment with the gods. Any ancient city would come to the conclusion under such circumstances that the gods have forsaken them. And for the Athenians going through a war, sure that they are the ideal Greeks, that the Spartans are in the wrong, and that the gods will support them in this, just as they, intervened during the Trojan War, and to have themselves instead subjected to the gods' wrath, or having the gods not present, not helping them. And so, as a result of this, one of the things we see in the second half of the war is a more brutal Athens. And this is partly the outgrowth of Athenian arrogance. But it may also be connected to this failure of idealism that's brought about as part of the psychological consequences of the plague. The excerpts from the reader, these are all from Thucydides, and Thucydides is talking about the actual experience of the war. Thucydides is there for this, what Athens is choosing to do. And so the civil war in Corcyra gives us a good sense of the conflicts between the Greeks and also the conflicts within the Greek cities, between the few and the many. This is giving us a sense of what the Greeks called stasis, which is sort of the gridlock and turmoil and friction that comes about as a result of this intensifying conflict between the few and the many. The funeral oration is a very famous speech that gives the Athenian point of view about themselves. This is Athens presenting itself as the beacon for the rest of the Greeks, as the city on the hill that all the rest of the Greeks look up to, and that Athens has to live up to that. And so this is very important for the Athenian view on why they fight. Plague of Athens, we've talked about. This account is very detailed and meticulous, and is an excellent model for the conduct of history by historians. And the Melian dialogue, Melos says, we would rather suffer the consequences of Athenian wrath than to voluntarily give up our freedom. This is dramatized in dialogue and presented to us as a dramatic moment. But the ultimatum and the refusal are a part of history, a part of the story of Athens shifting from hegemon and towards tyranny over its allies. All the following true about Alkibiades, except, he is handsome, charming, and pleasure-seeking. He advocated expanding the empire, leading to the Sicilian expedition. He would have been leader of the Sicilian expedition had he not been charged with heresy, and so he defected to Sparta, which allows him to suggest to Sparta the way in which they can bring about an end to the war. What he didn't do is return to Athens and open a brothel. The Spartans also kicked him out, and he ended up in Persian territory. Who's most to blame for the Peloponnesian War? There are three major possibilities if you want to blame a particular city. One is Athens for its aggressive pursuit of economic power and cultural power. One is Sparta for its arrogance and for seeking to exclude all other Greeks. And Corinth, who is actually extremely provocative before the war in turning every Athenian action into an attack on Corinth. There's a certain extent to which Corinth is justified in this, in that Athens does seek to diminish Corinthian trading power by expanding into the Adriatic, by planting a colony of ex-helots on the coast of the Corinthian Gulf, by establishing these bound colonies called clerices. But Corinth is actively inciting toward conflict. The longer-term problems are the fierce independence of the Greek cities and their pursuit of their own visions of the ideal are inherently going to bring them into conflict. And so this goes back to geography, how the city-states of Hellas are inherently insular and separated, and so form these very intense patriotic identities that are very separate from each other, and their collective pursuit of the ideal leads them off onto different vectors, and at the extremes these ideals are incompatible. Once they are seeking to bring about hegemony after the Persian Wars, the leadership of Athens becomes intolerable to the Spartans, the leadership of Sparta becomes intolerable to Athenians, and so at root here, the real cause of this is the nature of Hellas itself. The conflict within the polis between the Aristoi and the Demos brings about constant conflict, constant drive to transform within each polis, because friction brings about change in history. And the isolation, separation of the polis brings about the much more fierce and intense city-state identity than we find in other city-state cultures. So once again, this is something that you can argue from all sides, and you might want to practice being Strepsiades and taking each position and seeing what the arguments are. In this case, all of these positions have merit, and it's as it has been for Greek historians for the last 2,400 years. It's up to you to decide what you think at the end of the day. And that's the end of the quiz. Please email me with any questions.